stepmother and stepsister pretended to be loving, but in reality, they wanted to deprive me of my inheritance, so I am a 27-year-old guy who has lived with my father, stepmother, and stepsister for the past 7 years. My mother died when I was 18, and my father remarried perhaps a year later. It was a short marriage, and before I knew it, I had a new stepmother, Susan, and a stepsister, Emily, who was 3 years my junior. At first, everything seemed fine, not amazing but bearable. Susan attempted to portray the part of a devoted mother, but it always felt forced. Emily seemed nice, but distant. I put it up to the strangeness of our new family dynamic, assuming things would better with time. Once I overheard a plot by my stepmother and half-sister to deprive me of my parents' inheritance. My father plunged himself into his job when my mother died, and this did not alter once he remarried. He is a successful company owner who frequently travels or works late. This resulted in my spending a lot of time with Susan and Emily, which was good at first. When Dad came home, we had family meals, and everything appeared to be normal. I went to college but stayed local, returning home on weekends and holidays. After graduation, I moved back in while seeking for work in my industry. This is when things began to shift. Susan grew less hospitable, commenting that I should have been out on my own by now. Emily, who had recently completed her own degree, also moved back in. Suddenly, the home felt cramped, and there was an underlying tension that I couldn't pinpoint. I have been job seeking for some months now, sending out applications and attending interviews. It has been difficult in this economy, but I am trying. Dad has been encouraging, advising me to take my time and find the proper match. Susan, on the other hand, has become increasingly vociferous about my desire to move out. Last month, I overheard a discussion that flipped my life upside down. I was in my room with the door closed when I heard Susan and Emily conversing in the corridor. They must have assumed I was gone since they were making no effort to keep their voices down. Susan mentioned that they needed to get rid of me before the will was finished. Emily agreed, explaining that they couldn't risk giving me an equal portion. It was obvious they were referring to me. I sat there motionless while they resumed their chat. They explored several methods for persuading my father that I needed to move out. Susan recommended restricting my access to the family car, making it more difficult for me to get to interviews. Emily suggested accidentally damaging my laptop so that I could not apply for jobs online. The chat lasted what seemed like hours, but was really just 15 minutes. They discussed how much money they could make if I wasn't in the picture, as well as trips and purchases they could make, all while conspiring to ruin my life. When they eventually walked away from my door, I was ill to my stomach. These were individuals I'd known for years, who I considered family, and now they were planning against me as if I were an impediment to be eliminated. The following few days were a blur. I tried to behave normally, but it was difficult. Every encounter with Susan and Emily seemed contaminated now. I observed them occasionally staring at me with calculating expressions in their eyes. It made my skin crawl. I considered informing my father, but I hesitated. He appeared content with Susan, and I didn't want to be the one to break that illusion. Plus, I lacked proof. It would be my word against theirs, and I didn't know whose side he'd pick. So I decided to keep things cool and make preparations. I asked several pals if they needed a roommate. I stepped up my job hunt, applying for occupations I previously believed were beneath me, anything to get out of this house. A week after overhearing the talk, I received my first break. A friend of a friend wanted someone to lease their flat for 7 months while they studied overseas. The rent was high, but it was manageable if I tapped into my funds. I leaped at the opportunity. When I told my father I was moving out, he appeared shocked but supportive. Susan and Emily, on the other hand, couldn't contain their excitement. They pretended to assist me in packing, exchanging knowing glances when they thought I wasn't paying attention. When I moved out, I overheard them again. This time, they were debating ways to prevent Dad from changing the will now that I was gone. It made me understand that they didn't simply want me out of the house. They wanted to completely cut me off. I've been in my new house for a month now. It's little and not in a great location, but it's just mine. I'm still looking for work and taking on odd jobs to supplement my income. It isn't ideal, but it is preferable than staying in that place with folks who regard me as nothing more than a hindrance to their inheritance. Dad calls every couple days to check in. He's noticed that I am not around as much lately, and I can tell he is concerned. I make excuses about being preoccupied with job seeking and adapting into my new surroundings. I can bring myself to tell him the truth, not yet anyhow. I considered hiring a lawyer to secure my inheritance, but the fact is that I don't care about money. What stings is knowing that the individuals I thought were my family saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their financial gain. Sometimes late at night, I wonder whether my mother will be disappointed in me for not fighting more. But then I recall how Mom always told me that family is about love, not blood or formal paperwork. According to that concept, Susan and Emily were never truly my family. I don't know what the future holds. Part of me wants to confront them and call them out on their schemes. Another part of me wants to walk away and never look back. For the time being, I am focused on creating my own life, one that is independent of anybody else's goodwill or inheritance. Last week, I finally got a job. It is entry level, and the compensation is low, but it is a start. I have not told Dad yet. I'm not sure I want Susan or Emily to know anything about my life anymore. The less they know, the less they can attempt sabotage. I started therapy, the lowest option I could find, to work with my feelings of anger and betrayal. It is gradually making a difference. My therapist advised that I write letters to Susan and Emily, not to send, but to express my sentiments. I've filled notebooks with things I wish I could tell them. Sometimes I have dreams about my mother. In these dreams, Mom is constantly smiling and saying how pleased she is of me. I wake up with a sense of warmth and loss. I miss her more than ever now, wishing I had her direction to get through this mess. I considered contacting my mother's side of the family. We lost touch when she died, primarily because the experience was too upsetting for all of us. But now I crave that connection. Perhaps it is time to repair those bridges. As the months passed, I fell into a routine work, home, repeat. It's not thrilling, but it's reliable. I am steadily creating a life for myself that has nothing to do with Susan, Emily, or my fortune. Dad's birthday is coming up in 2 months. I am considering whether or not to attend the family dinner. Part of me wants to see him and rejoice with him, but the notion of sitting across the table from Susan and Emily, pretending everything is okay, makes me sick. I've started helping at a local youth center on weekends. Many of the children there are from broken households or have lost their parents. I can relate to them in ways I couldn't before this happened. Helping these youngsters handle their sorrow and fury has been therapeutic in its own right. Sometimes I worry what Susan and Emily tell others about why I moved out so abruptly. Do they portray me as the ungrateful stepson who abandoned the family, or do they simply deny I existed? I try not to think about it, but it does come up from time to time. I've made several new pals at work and while volunteering. It's good to have people in my life that recognize me for who I am, not for my possible inheritance or family ties. These relationships feel more authentic than those I experienced with Susan and Emily. I saw Emily at the grocery store the other day. The situation was unpleasant, to say the least. She was very pleasant, inquiring about my career and new location. I gave vague responses and got out of there as fast as possible. The event left me unsettled for several days. I have started thinking about my long-term plans. Do I want to stay in this city, where I may run into Susan or Emily at any time, or do I want to start over somewhere fresh, where no one knows anything about my past? The concept is appealing, but I am not sure I am ready to leave my father behind just yet. As my lease nears the conclusion, I am presented with decisions. Should I renew or hunt for a better place? Moving again is taxing, but so is the prospect of remaining in this cramped flat eternally. It is simply another reminder of how much my life has changed in such little time. I've lately begun dating nothing serious, just a few casual dates here and there. It's been enjoyable, but also tough. I am scared to open out for fear of getting wounded or misled again. My therapist says this is normal, and it will take time to regain my confidence in others. Work is going great. I just received a little promotion, which has helped alleviate. My financial situation has become quite stressful. I am no longer diving into my funds every month to cover rent. It is a minor triumph, but it feels important. I still haven't told Dad about overhearing Susan and Emily talking. Every time I consider bringing it up, I talk myself out of it. What happens if he doesn't believe me? What if it develops a divide between us? The prospect of losing him is more than I can handle. Sometimes I become upset at my mother for dying and leaving me in this circumstance. I realize it's ridiculous, but the feeling continues. If she were present, none of this would be occurring. I still have a home, a family, and a feeling of community. I attempt to dismiss these ideas, yet they persist. I've begun learning how to cook. It was something I never had to do while I lived at home, but it is now a must. I'm not great at it yet, but I'm getting better. There's something fulfilling about making a meal from scratch and feeding yourself in this physical way. The holidays are approaching, bringing with them a whole new set of problems. Do I travel home for Christmas and New Year's, or do I find excuses to remain away? The notion of artificial grins and forced enthusiasm at the dinner table turns my stomach, but spending the holidays alone isn't any better. I've been having difficulty sleeping recently. I lie awake at night, rehearsing the overheard exchange in my mind. I go over every contact I've had with Susan and Emily since they entered my life, wondering whether there were any warning flags I overlooked. It's taxing, yet I can seem to turn my mind off. I have considered contacting Susan and Emily directly, telling them that I heard everything and understand what they are attempting to achieve. But what would this accomplish? They'd most likely dispute it or distort it in some way, and it would end up generating more difficulties than it solved. Some days I am okay. I go to work, come home, and live my life. Other days, the weight of all that has transpired overwhelms me. On some days, it's difficult to get out of bed and confront a world in which the people who were meant to be my family viewed me as nothing more than an impediment. I've begun keeping a notebook, recording my thoughts and feelings every day. It helps to get everything out on paper. Maybe someday I'll look back at these posts and realize how far I've come. They are currently serving as a chronicle of this turbulent period in my life. As I approach the 9-month milestone of living alone, I find myself pondering on all that has occurred. I am no longer the person I was when I overheard the exchange. I am stronger in some respects, but more frail in others. I am learning to stand on my own 2 feet and create a life that isn't dependent on anybody else as generosity or inheritance. I am not sure what the future holds. Will I ever confront Susan and Emily? Will I tell Dad the truth? Will I be able to move on from this betrayal and form trusted connections again? These questions remain unaddressed. For the time being, I am taking each day as it comes, focused on creating my own life. It is not easy, and it is not the life I expected, but it is mine, and perhaps that is enough. Update 1. I walked out of my father's house over a year ago after overhearing my stepmother and stepsister planning to get rid of me. Much has changed in that time, and not all for the better. I am sorry for the delay in updating this post. Life has been quite stressful, and I have been fighting to find the time and emotional stamina to sit down and write it all out. Between job, treatment, and attempting to keep my head above water, maintaining Reddit wasn't a top priority. But I know many of you have been wondering what happened, so I'm now pushing myself to post an update. Thank you to everyone who responded to my initial article with advice, encouragement, and good comments. Your letters meant more to me than you realize, especially during those first few difficult months on my own. I attempted to read every remark, even if I didn't have the time to answer to everyone. Your encouragement has been a bright point in an otherwise gloomy period, and I am grateful for this group. So on with the update. I'm still in the job I got shortly after moving out. The work is okay, however the compensation is barely adequate to support my expenditures. I've been seeking for greater opportunities, but the work market is challenging. Every rejection letter seems like a personal failure, a reminder that I am still striving to get my life in order. My connection with my father has become tense. I've been avoiding family gatherings and inventing reasons not to go. He's aware, of course. He calls more regularly now, wondering whether everything is well. I hate lying to him, but I just can't bring myself to tell him the truth about why I left. The few times I've seen him, he seems anxious and fatigued. I'm wondering if Susan and Emily are giving him tension, or if it's simply my concern. I ended up attending to his birthday dinner a few weeks ago. It was just as unpleasant as I had expected. Susan and Emily were all smiles and phony cheer, inquiring about my work and apartment with syrupy concern. I could see the calculation in their eyes, calculating if I was struggling enough to relinquish any claim to an inheritance. I departed as quickly as possible, using an excuse about an early meeting the next day. The holidays were tough. I told Dad I couldn't make it home for Christmas because I had to work. In truth, I spent the entire day alone in my flat, eating microwave turkey dinner and watching old movies. It was dismal but preferable than pretending to be a happy family with Susan and Emily. I have been thinking more and more about telling my father the truth, but every time I do, I talk myself out of it. What happens if he doesn't believe me? What if it develops a divide between us? Worse, what if he believes me but still decides to stay with Susan? I'm not sure I could handle that kind of rejection. My treatment sessions have been beneficial, but the development is sluggish. I am still dealing with the hatred and betrayal I feel. My therapist says that it's normal and that mending takes time, but some days I feel like I'll never get over it. I've had a couple more encounters with Emily around town. Every time she acts as if everything is normal and we are still one big happy family. It makes my skin crawl. I've started avoiding specific businesses and restaurants, mainly to reduce the chances of encountering her or Susan. Volunteering at the youth center has been a positive experience. I've bonded with several of the kids there, notably Jacob, a teenager who lost his mother last year. In some ways, assisting him in dealing with his sadness has been therapeutic for me. It serves as a reminder that there is still good in the world, and relationships can still be created. I've tried dating several times in the last year, but it hasn't gone well. I find it difficult to open up, as if I'm always waiting for something to go wrong. My last date ended with a girl telling me that I had too much baggage. She's probably correct. My lease is up next month and I'm not sure what I'll do. The prospect of relocating is taxing, but I'm also sick of this little apartment with its noisy neighbors and unpredictable heating. I've been looking for places in different sections of town, maybe even the next city over. A fresh start is appealing. I ended up contacting my mother's sister, Aunt Laura. We hadn't talked in years since Mom's funeral. It was odd at first, but as we chatted, I felt like I was reconnecting with a forgotten part of myself. She invited me to join her family for a weekend. I'm thinking about it, but the thought of recounting all that has transpired is frightening. Work has become increasingly stressful recently. There have been whispers of layoffs, and as one of the newer employees, I am concerned that I may be let go. The notion of losing my job scares me. I don't have much funds left, and I'm not sure how long I could survive without an income. I've begun having dreams about becoming homeless, about having to return to Dad's house and confront Susan and Emily. I awoke in a chilly sweat, my pulse beating. It takes hours to be relaxed enough to sleep again. My birthday passed without any hoopla. Dad called, of course, and a few friends took me out for drinks, but it was difficult not to compare it to previous birthdays, when Mom was living and we'd have enormous family gatherings. The contrast was sharp and dismal. I have been thinking about my mother a lot recently. I wonder what she would think of all of this, and how she would counsel me on how to manage it. Sometimes I chat to her portrait and tell her everything that has happened. It may be foolish, but it helps. My rage at Susan and Emily hasn't subsided much over the last year. It has really become worse. I imagine approaching them and telling them all I know. In my daydreams, they break down and confess, and their father kicks them out. But I know it's all imagination. I've started researching legal possibilities just in case. I met with an estate law specialist. He said that without proof, there is little I can do to secure any prospective inheritance. He proposed talking to my father about establishing a trust, but that would require telling him everything. I'm not prepared for it yet. My health has deteriorated as a result of the stress. I have lost weight and am constantly exhausted. My doctor says my blood pressure is high, and I should find methods to relax. Easier said than done. I have considered moving away totally and starting over in a different place where I won to run into Susan or Emily. But the thought of leaving Dad behind and maybe never seeing him again is too difficult to ponder seriously. There have been moments of brightness amidst the gloom. I've made a few good pals at work and while volunteering. They don't know the entire story, but they've been supportive in their own ways. It is good to have people in my life that like me for who I am, rather than for what I may inherit. I've taken up several new activities to pass the time and keep my mind off things. I've started learning to play the guitar, something I've always wanted to do, but never had the time for. I am not very skilled yet, but the process of learning is enjoyable. I have also begun running. At first, it was just a way to get out of my apartment and clear my mind, but I've discovered that I like it. There's something liberating about pushing my body to its limits and putting all my troubles behind for a bit. As the 1-year anniversary of my move out approached, I became increasingly concerned. It seemed like I should have made more progress and been in a better place by now. My therapist tells me I am being too harsh on myself and that recovery isn't linear. I'm trying to believe her. I did end up going to see Aunt Laura and her family. It was good to be around individuals who knew my mother and could tell me things about her I hadn't heard before. For one weekend, I felt like I belonged somewhere again. However, returning to my empty flat was more difficult than I had anticipated. The visit also triggered some mixed emotions. Aunt Laura inquired about Dad and how he was doing with his new bride. I was unable to respond, choking on the words. She noticed, of course, and politely inquired for further details. I wound up telling her everything. Aunt Laura was upset on my behalf. She wanted to contact her father right away and face Susan and Emily personally. I had to calm her down and explain why I had not told him yet. She disagreed with my decision, but she respected it. Before I went, she asked me swear to stay in touch and let her know if I needed anything. It has been reassuring to know that someone from my mother's side of the family is supporting me. Aunt Laura has been calling me on a regular basis to check in. She has even offered to let me stay with her family if things grow too bad financially. I'm not ready to take her up on it yet, but it's good to know the option is available. Dad's situation deteriorated last week. He arrived at my flat unexpectedly, worried expression on his face. He stated he couldn't take the distance between us longer and wanted to know what was going on. I attempted to deflect and offer excuses, but he was not having it. We ended up speaking for hours. I told him everything, overhearing Susan and Emily's chat, my concerns about the bequest, and why I had avoided family gatherings. It all poured out in a surge of emotion that I couldn't contain. Dad listened intently, his expression getting graver with each syllable. After I finished, he remained quiet for a long time. Then he apologized. He said he had no knowledge any of this was happening and had been completely unaware of what was going on in his own house. He didn't say he believed me, but he also didn't ignore my worries. He vowed to check into things and pay greater attention to Susan and Emily's actions. He also claimed he'd consult with his lawyer about securing my inheritance, regardless of what transpired in his marriage. I felt relieved after our conversation, as if a weight had been removed, but I also felt awful about potentially interrupting his life and marriage. Dad informed me that I had done the right thing by informing him, and that he needed to know. But I could sense turmoil in his eyes. It has been a week since our discussion, and I haven't heard anything from Dad. He texted to say he was looking into it and would be in touch shortly. I'm trying not to read too much into the stillness, but it's difficult not to worry. Susan contacted me yesterday, her voice honey-sweet, and asked me to Sunday supper. I rejected, citing work-related reasons. I am curious whether she is aware that my father and I spoke, and if she is attempting to mitigate the situation. The concept makes me feel somewhat queasy. As I enter my second year on my own, I find myself at a crossroads. Do I stay here near to Dad, Susan, and Emily? Do I accept Aunt Laura's offer and move closer to my mother's family? Do I break out on my own, relocate to a different city and start over? I don't have any answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, I believe I have alternatives. The future remains unknown, but it does not appear as dismal as it did a year ago. I'm not truly all right, but I think I am getting there. For now, I am taking things one day at a time. I am focused on my career, volunteering, and new interests. I am focusing on creating my own life, one that is not dependent on anybody else's goodwill or legacy. It is not easy, and it is not the life I expected, but it is mine, and perhaps that is enough. The chat with Dad rekindled a lot of old sentiments. I am thinking more about my mother than ever, and I am wondering what she'd think of everything. Would she be proud of me for standing on my own or unhappy that I didn't fight harder? I'll never know, and the uncertainty gnaws at me. I have been having difficulty sleeping again. Every time my phone rings, I jump, wondering if it's Dad calling with news. The wait is terrible. I have put myself into work and hobbies, anything to keep my mind occupied, but in the quiet moments, the fear returns. Update 2. Emily attempted to friend me on social media last week. I disregarded the request, but it made me feel uncomfortable. Is she attempting to keep an eye on me, or is this simply another attempt to preserve the appearance of a happy family? In any case, I have no interest in participating. I've been thinking a lot about the future recently. Before all of this, I had vague ambitions to go graduate school or advance in my work. Now I'm locked in survival mode, attempting to keep my head above water. I wonder whether I'll ever be able to think about the future with optimism rather than fear. The lease on my flat expires next week. After considerable deliberation, I've chosen to relocate not far, but to a somewhat better apartment in a different section of town. It is a little step, but it feels big since I am choosing to go ahead rather than remain frozen in place. I ate supper with Jacob from the youth center last night. He's about to go college, and he wanted to thank me for all of my help over the last year. Seeing how far he's gone, how he's dealing with his loss and going on with his life, gives me a sense of optimism. Perhaps I can do the same. As I pack up my flat, I find myself reflecting on my life. A year ago, I left my family home with only a bag and a wounded heart. I now have a job, an apartment, and pals. It's not much, but it's something I created for myself. There's some pride in that, but there is also lasting anguish and uncertainty. I'm still waiting to hear from Dad about what he discovered. The stillness is terrible, but I am trying to remain patient. Whatever happens, I'm confident I'll handle it. I'm stronger today than I was a year ago. I have overcome betrayal, loneliness, and uncertainty. I can handle whatever happens next. For the time being, I am concentrating on my relocation, settling into my new apartment, making it seem like home, and continuing to establish my own life. Regardless of what happens to Dad, Susan, and Emily, this is not the life I expected, but it is the one I am experiencing, and it should suffice for today. Final update. It's been almost 3 months since my previous update, and a lot has transpired. I'm not sure where to start, so I'll go with the major news. Dad finally made a choice. After our conversation in which I told him everything about overhearing Susan and Emily's intentions, Dad spent weeks researching. He hired a private investigator, reviewed bank documents, and even planned a sting operation that he wanted to tell me about. But in the end, he found enough proof to back up what I told him, and then some. Susan and Emily had been siphoning money from Dad's accounts for years. They'd been making tiny withdrawals, nothing huge enough to raise suspicion, but they mounted up to a lot over time. They had also been urging Dad to amend his will, employing emotional manipulation techniques that the PI had recorded. When Dad presented them with the proof, all hell broke out. Susan first denied everything before blaming it all on Emily. Emily broke down and admitted everything, throwing Susan under the bus in the process. It was a mess. Long story short, Dad filed for divorce. He's also pursuing allegations for financial wrongdoing. Susan and Emily had moved out, and the last I heard, they were residing with Susan's sister in another state. I have conflicting feelings about everything. On the one hand, I feel justified. Everything I dreaded, everything I heard, was true. On the other hand, I despise seeing Dad go through this anguish. He adored Susan, or believed he did. He was devastated to discover that everything had been a deception. Dad and I have been communicating more lately. He has apologized several times for not noticing what was going on and for not believing me sooner. I have forgiven him, yet our connection remains strained. We are working on it, though. We've begun having weekly dinners for just the two of us. It might be awkward at times, but it is a start. As for me, I am still at my new residence. I believe the relocation benefited me. It seems like a new beginning, a location that is really mine, with no links to Susan or Emily. I've progressively furnished it to make it seem like home. It isn't much, but it's mine, which means something. Work has been going well. The layoffs I was afraid about didn't materialize, and I even received a little rise. It's not much, but it's enough to allow me to stop living paycheck to paycheck. I've begun saving a little amount each month. It is not much, but it's a beginning. Therapy is continuing. My therapist thinks I'm making improvement, even if it doesn't always seem that way. The anger and betrayal are still present, but they are not as overwhelming as they previously were. I am learning to accept what occurred and not let it define me. I have been spending more time with my mother's side of the family. Aunt Laura has been a lifesaver during all of this. She has become a surrogate mother figure for me, often offering advice or simply listening when I need it. I have started seeing her family more frequently and getting to know my relatives better. It's comforting to feel like I have a family again, even if it's not the one I grew up with. Dating is still tough. I've had a couple dates, but nothing meaningful. I am still working on trusting people and opening out. My therapist says this is typical and will take time. I am trying to be gentle with myself. One unexpected development is that I've begun writing. Nothing spectacular, simply journaling at beginning. But lately, I've been thinking of converting my experiences into a book, either a memoir or a fictitious account. I'm not sure yet, but writing has been cathartic, allowing me to digest all that has transpired. Last week, Dad and I had a long conversation regarding inheritance. He established a trust for me, apart from his own holdings. He claims he wants to make sure I am taken care of regardless of what happens. I attempted to tell him it was unnecessary and that I didn't care about the money, but he insisted. I believe this is his attempt to make atonement. Dad has been talking about selling the house. He thinks he has too many negative memories. A part of me is sad about this. It was my boyhood home after all, but I understood his desire for a new beginning. We've been looking at smaller spaces together. He jokes about becoming roommates, but I believe we both understand the importance of having our own place. I saw one of Emily S. pals at the grocery store last week. She stared at me and said something about me wrecking Emily S. life. I wanted to shout and protect myself. Instead, I simply walked away. Their opinions no longer matter. I know the truth, and that is enough. Work has been a fantastic diversion during this. I've immersed myself into my career, taking on additional assignments whenever possible. My employer has noticed. She has hinted at a potential promotion in the near future. It is good to feel respected and to know that my efforts are paying off. Dad and I are arranging a trip together. Nothing spectacular, simply a weekend at a neighboring lake. We used to go camping there when I was a youngster before Mom became ill. It seems like a start towards healing our connection and making new memories to replace the unpleasant ones. I've been thinking a lot about my mother recently, wondering what she would think of all that has transpired. I miss her more than ever. Last time I went, Aunt Laura handed me a box of Mom's old belongings, including photographs, letters, and even some of her jewelry. Going through it was both emotional and healing. It's great to have these real links to her. I've started contacting old acquaintances who I lost touch with after Susan and Emily went down. Some have been responsive, some not so much, but it feels nice to be rebuilding my support network and having people in my life once again. The legal processes against Susan and Emily are still underway. Dad's lawyer keeps us updated, but I try not to dwell on it too much. They will face the repercussions of their deeds, but I don't want their fate to dominate my life anymore. I've been thinking about the future more recently, not just getting by day to day, but genuinely planning forward. I am considering returning to school, maybe for a Master's degree. It's a big step, but I finally feel like I can do it. There are still hard days, but the good ones are beginning to exceed the bad. I'm not all right yet, but I'm getting there. I am creating a life for myself that isn't defined by what Susan and Emily attempted to do with me. It's not the life I expected, but it's mine. And for the first time in a long time, I'm enthusiastic about the future. Thank you to everyone who has followed my journey and contributed support and advice along the road. Your kindness has meant more than you realize. This will be my last update. It is time for me to shut this chapter of my life and start writing the next one. Wish me luck.